The only thing sexier than drone footage is sexy drone footage. And I'm gonna teach you how to get it in this video. What's up, YouTube? It's your boy, B-Mac. So you guys know by now, I'm a pretty big drone guy. Today, I'm gonna walk you guys through pretty much every single setting I have to capture cinematic photos and videos from your drone. And right here, clearly I have my DJI Phantom 4 Pro that I'm gonna use to demo with these settings, but even if you're using a different drone, even if things look a little bit different, you will benefit from all the settings we talk about, because I'm gonna briefly explain what each one means. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be flying this puppy like a pro, getting the cinematic photo and video you've always dreamed of. So without further ado, let's fire this baby up. I'm gonna turn on the drone, turn on the remote controller. Go time, baby. All right, so here we are in the DJI Go Flight app, and the first thing I'm gonna do is make sure we have video mode enabled. You can do this by seeing the little movie recording button above the record button right there, which we do. And then next up, I'm gonna head right into the preferences/settings menu by clicking the icon directly below the record button. And we're actually gonna work in reverse here. Instead of going left to right, I'm gonna go right to left, showing you guys the settings, because there are some settings all the way to the right that I think you should have turned on first. So diving right in here, we have a bunch of different sliders here. You can either enable them or disable them, starting things out with histogram. Histogram, I have that enabled, because what that'll do is have a nice little histogram pop-up box that you could click and drag anywhere on your screen, and this will allow you to have a quick eye on exposure levels in addition to the EV that you have on the top there. So it's super helpful to have just as a quick reference, and you could put it anywhere on your screen, which is pretty cool. Next up, we have head LEDs auto turn off. I actually have this enabled. This allows me to take photos and videos in the air with the front LEDs of the drone actually turned off. So that way, when you're actually taking a photo or filming, the light from these LEDs won't get into the lens, therefore potentially ruining your shot. Next up, we have lock gimbal when capture. I have that enabled. This will make sure that your gimbal does not move during a photo, which is helpful because if you're taking a photo and it's a long exposure photo, you don't want to be able to move that around using the remote controller, so lock gimbal when capture will prevent that. Next up, enable AFC mode. This is super important to have enabled. Basically what this will allow you to do is have autofocus continuous mode turned on, and will allow you to use your drone's autofocus features if your drone has adjustable focus in the continuous mode. Next up, you want to make sure you have overexposed turned on. Now if we move the drone for a second here and show you my ring light, you'll see if we toggle that off, those zebra stripes go away, but if we turn overexposed on, those zebra stripes come back. Those zebra stripes act as a visual overexposure warning, so when you're shooting video or photo, you can see what parts or elements within your scene are overexposed. Really cool, quick, and easy way to see if you need to make exposure adjustments. Next up, mechanical shutter. Turn that baby on. I'm definitely not gonna get into the differences between mechanical shutter and digital shutter here. Just know that it's almost always a better option to have mechanical shutter for photo on the drone, because your photos will look better that way. They'll look more realistic. You won't have anything funky going on. So without getting into too much detail, mechanical shutter, have that enabled. And the next up, video caption. Have this enabled as well. I don't think I've actually ever used this feature, but what it basically does is it saves information about your camera settings at the time of shooting as a caption file, so that you could refer to that information when you're looking back at footage to see what your settings were in case you needed that information for whatever reason. But it's nice to know you have that option there. It doesn't affect your video footage, so if you could enable that and have that extra information in case you need it, why not? Next up, we have autofocus focus assistant and manual focus focus assistant. You really don't have to worry about these two settings because right now they only work in photo mode and not in video mode. But for reference, with either autofocus focus assistant or manual focus focus assistant turned on, when tapping to focus in autofocus mode or manually adjusting the focus in manual focus mode, the app will digitally zoom in a slight amount in your bracket area to help you better see if your focus is set correctly. But again, this won't make any difference for video, it's just for photo. This is just for your reference if you want to start taking photos and not just video. Next up, let's talk about the grid. I have grid enabled here, and I actually have grid and diagonals selected. You can pick either grid lines or grid and diagonals. That'll put an overlay over your frame within the display of the app. And I like grid and diagonals because the grid is the rule of thirds grid right there that'll make sure I'm obeying the rule of thirds. Whereas I actually use the diagonals for camera movements. So I'd suggest at least having the grid on with the grid lines, but if you want to start using the diagonals as as additional guides, you could use those too. Next up, we have center points. I actually have this enabled, as you would probably guess. And I actually have the bracket with center point option selected with the custom color of yellow. Now this is all personal preference right here. That's basically all it comes down to with this setting. If I move the manual focus out of the way here, you can see that in the middle. I just like this bracket with the yellow color because it usually stands out the most against the scene I'm shooting, and again, can help with my overall camera movements by serving as a guide. Next up, we have anti-flicker. Now you don't have to do a whole lot of worrying here. Basically this has to do with power supply frequencies, which changes depending on the country you're in. The drone knows where you are, so you might as well just set that to auto and forget about it. And then just a couple more settings here. We have file index mode, which basically just shows what the file name will be. You could have it reset, or you could just have it continuous. For my workflow, I have the file index mode set to reset so that every time I clear the SD card, the numbers start from 0 again. It just works better that way for my personal workflow. You can choose whatever works best for you. And then we have peaking threshold. Now this is very important. Going back to focus for a second, if we go to focus on my Fortnite dudes right here again with autofocus so that the focus is set quickly and efficiently for me, you'll notice a little bit of red outline around the edges of those elements. Now what these red outlines around those edges mean is that's the area of the frame that the camera is recognizing as in focus. Those red outlines are a super helpful way just to quickly see what's in focus and what's not just by looking at your display. And I have that set to a threshold of high because I want to be very specific with what's sharp and in focus. But you could use either low or normal, whatever works best for you. Play around with the peaking threshold, see what works for your eyes, and you could choose that setting. And then last but not least, camera settings. Basically what this allows you to do is set different presets or profiles for different camera settings without having to go in and change each individual setting that you want to change for different locations or times of day, whatever the case might be. And then to finish things up, we have format SD card and reset camera settings, both of which do exactly what you think they would do. Format SD card basically clears out your SD card, starts fresh, and then reset camera settings resets all your camera settings back to the factory defaults. Now moving on to the picture settings, and this is where things start to get pretty fun. Starting things out with video size. Now 9 times out of 10, I'm shooting in 3840 by 2160 resolution. That's 4K Ultra HD, but you could choose whatever resolution works best for your workflow or your needs. Just remember, you could always downscale your high resolution footage to work on a lower resolution timeline, but you can't add that resolution back in. So if you shoot in 1080 and all of a sudden you're working on a 4K timeline, the difference in resolution, if you did not film that resolution in the original video file, you can't just magically add that back. That's why I personally shoot at a resolution of 4K or higher, so I have that resolution to work with in case I need it. And surprisingly, I actually don't shoot in 24 frames per second like my other cameras often do. And even though I upload to YouTube in 24 frames per second, I don't use 24 frames per second when shooting video on my drone. I actually choose 30 frames per second, and here's why. I've noticed those few extra frames per second you get when shooting 30 frames per second as opposed to 24 frames per second allow for a pretty cool cinematic effect when slowing those 30 frames per second down to 24 frames per second on a 24 frames per second video timeline. It's basically the same concept as slow-mo here, except going from 30 to 24 isn't really slow-mo. It's only a 20% reduction in speed, but time and time again, I've seen that little 20% reduction in speed to be pretty cinematic when I'm editing my final videos for the drone. So try that little pro tip out, let me know what you think. 3840 by 2160 at 30 frames per second, 9 times out of 10, that's the resolution and frame rate I'm shooting in, but you could check out the other resolutions and frame rates available for them, such as 120 frames per second slow-mo if you want to shoot slow-mo on your drone, and see how those different resolutions and frame rates work for you. After video size, we also have video format. Now this is a little surprising to some people because I actually have my video format set to MP4. Usually if you ask a video creator what format to have, they'll tell you to use .mov for Mac or .mp4 for Windows. Now I edit my videos on a Mac, but I choose .mp4 because I do pretty much all my video editing right now within Premiere Pro, and in my experience, Premiere Pro seems to like MP4 better, and since I'm usually exporting to the MP4 file format anyway, why not just save a little bit of time on the export and choose MP4 to begin with. There won't be a huge difference here, you won't have any real difference in quality, just choose whatever works best for your workflow. I use MP4. NTSC/PAL, I am not gonna get into the differences here. This is basically the broadcasting standard for your country. It doesn't make a huge difference when you're uploading your drone videos to the internet, but if you wanna make sure you have the right setting, you can just quickly Google what setting is right for your country and then choose that here. You'll be good to go. And then next up we have white balance, currently set to auto white balance, which I highly recommend you do not use. I actually always have my white balance set to custom with a temperature of 5500 Kelvin. Reason being, this is usually the daylight balanced Kelvin temperature when you're shooting video. And the reason why you don't want to have auto white balance is because when you're up in the air, you have a lot going on. You have lighting changes, you have subject changes, you have composition changes. All those different changes could confuse the camera with what the white balance should be set to. And with auto white balance, I've personally seen before a lot of lighting changes that cause coloring changes as well. And believe me, you do not want to have to deal with varying white balance settings throughout your shot that causes different coloring changes. That's a nightmare. Now you do have different options here, such as sunny, cloudy, incandescent, fluorescent. You can try all these to see what works best for the white balance for your particular scene and setting, but do not use auto white balance. After white balance, you have a couple different settings here. This is where I've spent a lot of time testing when it comes to the style and color. I've done so much test footage, I think I've come to a conclusion. And this is the best way of approaching this. On this window, you'll have the triangle on top, you'll have that little half circle, and then you'll have that gradient square. Basically, within this window, the triangle stands for sharpening, the half circle for contrast, and the gradient square for saturation. And with all three of these settings, really the thing you have to keep in mind is that you could always add sharpening, you could always add contrast, you could always add saturation, but it's a lot more difficult to try to take those settings out of your video footage if the sharpening, contrast, and saturation is too high and baked into the video footage itself. So I would suggest either using standard, soft, or custom. I personally use custom. And with custom, I have the sharpening set to -1, the contrast set to -3, and the saturation set to 0. Now I have the sharpening set to -1 because I found that to be a pretty good sweet spot for what the sharpening should be. Any less than -1, I found the footage to be kind of soft and hard to add sharpening back into. And anything with a sharpening set to 0 or higher kind of looked a little bit too sharp. And the more sharpening you have applied to your video footage, the more digital it looks. So for sharpening, I have that set to -1. Now with contrast, the lower your contrast, realistically, the better the dynamic range of your camera. That's why whenever possible, when I shoot on my Sony, when I shoot on my drone, I have the contrast as low as possible, and I have a very flat picture profile, because when you shoot very flat, that allows you to have the highest dynamic range and preserve the most detail possible. Contrast is one of those settings on the drone, at least. Realistically, you could put all the way down to -3, which is the lowest it could go, and you could always easily add the contrast back in when you're editing your video. And then for saturation, I have the set to 0. I used to have it set to -1, -2, sometimes even -3. I thought that just took too much saturation out of the video file, and so 0 seems a very natural level of saturation that I could always boost in post. So do yourself a favor here, see how these three different settings affect your video footage. I've done a lot of testing here. -1, -3, 0 are the three best settings I personally found when it comes to sharpening, contrast, and saturation. But try it out for yourself. I'm sure you'll see pretty quickly why these settings are pretty darn good when trying to have cinematic footage captured on your drone. Moving right along, let's go to another important setting on this picture settings menu right here. Color. Now with color, you can experiment with these different settings as well. If you go onto YouTube and just search color profiles for the drone, you'll find a bunch of different creators using a bunch of different profiles. You'll see a lot of creators actually suggesting you use D-Log. Now, D-Log isn't bad because of the low contrast you see right there, and already you can see more detail that you get out of that. But in my experience, it is very, very difficult to work with D-Log drone footage. It's almost too low contrast, and it's almost too low profile for me to actually make look good. I actually end up pushing some of the settings in post way too far to counteract the very low contrast and settings this D-Log profile has. You can also try the other settings you have here: normal, art, film, black and white. But most of these you can emulate when you're color balancing and color correcting in post anyway. So usually I don't even mess with these settings. I have Decinelike and I just keep it there. That's what I use for pretty much all the drone footage you see on this channel. And then for camera video encoding, if you have this option, just choose H.264. It's gonna take a while for H.265 to actually become more mainstream, and I'm not messing with that right now. I'm just sticking to H.264, so I would suggest you do the same. And that's pretty much it for picture settings, and now we have a few more settings we have to go over on the exposure menu. And you'll see right away here I have very specific settings that I'm dialing in, and for good reason. No matter what drone you're using, one thing I highly recommend is that you do not use auto exposure. Just like auto white balance, there's a lot going on in the sky when you're flying this thing in the air, a lot of lighting changes, and you guessed it, the camera's going to try to counteract those lighting changes by auto adjusting the exposure, which sounds good, but when you actually look back at the video footage, you could kind of get a strobing effect with the different stops being changed as it relates to the exposure settings on the camera, and then it'll just end up looking pretty digital, anti-cinematic, which for the purposes of this video, is not what we're going for. So I never use auto settings. I don't even use aperture or shutter priority mode like I have on this drone right here. I'm going full manual. Now, I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about ISO, aperture, and shutter. If you're flying a drone and you're flying a camera of this caliber, you probably already know what those settings mean, but here's a little bit of guidance. ISO, that's basically the camera's sensitivity to light. I have that as close to 100 as possible. Anything higher than ISO 400, even at ISO 400, you start to see digital noise. The more digital noise you have, the more noticeable it becomes and the less cinematic your video. Shutter, I almost always have twice my frame rate. Now, we already know I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, which means I usually have a shutter of 1/60th, or if I drop that down to 24 frames per second that I'm shooting at for whatever reason, in that case, I'd use a shutter of 1/50th. Now, as you can see from this preview image right here, we're not even in the sky, and we have a lot of parts of this image that are overexposed. Now, if I raise my shutter speed, that would fix the issue, but this reduces motion blur, and when you're flying, you have camera movement, it'll start to look more kind of high energy, kind of staticky and moving real quick, the images throughout your frame. Not something you want with cinematic video, so I rarely, if ever, try to change the shutter from whatever it would be twice the frame rate. Instead, I'm changing the aperture. Now, not all drones have this option right here, which we'll discuss in just a second, but you'll see if I start to close down the aperture all the way to something like f8, now all of a sudden we have a much more balanced image when it comes to exposure. That is one of the main reasons why I absolutely love this drone. That aperture that you could change comes in handy more times than you could probably imagine. But I know not all drones have the ability to change the aperture like that, in which case you're gonna wanna use an ND filter on your drone. In situations where you need to brighten the image, you might wanna start to creep up the ISO, but again, you'll notice once you start to go over ISO 800, you'll start to get a lot of noise in your shots. It's a balancing act here, that's part of setting the exposure, but one thing is for sure, it'll be much better than using auto exposure. Because I guarantee you, once you start flying this thing, and if you have auto exposure on, you'll look back at your footage on your computer and all of a sudden see, whoa, why is the camera going crazy? Why is the lighting getting so dark all of a sudden? Because of auto exposure. And that pretty much does it for my camera settings for cinematic video and photo on the drone. If you want to check out my drone footage using drones on this channel, you could do so by checking out my cinematic vlogs and cinematic diaries video playlist. A card annotation for that playlist is going to pop up top right hand corner of your screen, or as always, there will be a link to that video playlist in the video description box below as well, so check that out to see this bad boy in action. I still got a little bit of daylight out there. I'm gonna go fly this thing, get some nice cinematic shots. I'll see you guys in my next video. You are so sexy. Yeah, I love my drone a little bit more than the normal person would, but you know what? It is what it is.